Welcome to Investment Moments with Momentum Investments, where we talk to investment professionals and financial experts about investments and savings. We unpack all things investments to give you insights to help you achieve your financial goals. This is our first episode in our new series aimed at equipping you as a South African consumer and investor to understand what is happening in the economy locally and globally, and how this affects your daily cost of living and investments. Our focus for today will be on greylisting. Joining me for this discussion is Sanisha Packirisamy, Chief Economist at Momentum Investments. Sanisha, as South Africans, we were introduced to this term a few years ago when South Africa was greylisted. Public awareness of greylisting in South Africa is mixed, but generally low among the broader population. I think many of us knew it to be linked to state capture and corruption in the government. But let's simplify in more detail. What is greylisting?
Well, think about the grey list as a sort of watch list, not quite the blacklist, which is the naughty list, but a watch list in which investors are now a little bit more tuned to the increased risks of investing in South Africa. Now, this is typically monitored by an international body called the Financial Action Task Force, or most people call it the FATF. And the FATF is there to ensure that we've got all the securities in place to monitor and curb financial crimes. So things like terrorist financing or money laundering. Are we an economy that has all these issues into place so that we can curb that activity naturally, so that we don't have financial crime taking place at a rapid pace?
Thanks for that summary, Sanisha. Why did South Africa get greylisted back in 2023?
Well, the FATF did quite a deep dive on South Africa back in 2021. And in that report, they found that South Africa didn't necessarily have all the boxes ticked around what we need and mechanisms in place to curb this kind of illicit financial transactions. And then they made that difficult call to place South Africa on the grey list in February of 2023. But I also think it's important to note that we did tick a lot of boxes, and there were just a couple that we needed to make sure that we completely had a look at it to ensure that all those loopholes were closed. And one of the loopholes that we found was around how money is managed in the non-banking sector. So I think that the banks, mostly ticked those boxes, but when it came to money that's been transitioned between lawyers or accountants, or even in the real estate market where you have a lot of high risk activity, we didn't necessarily tick all of those boxes. In addition to that, thinking back to that time, we were reeling from all of the revelations that came out of state capture. And I think there was a perception out there that we weren't doing enough on the prosecutions for these financial crimes.
But what does greylisting mean for ordinary South Africans going about their day-to-day life? Take away the government and politics.
Well, in simple terms, it raises costs, unfortunately. So for banks, there's a lot more processes that need to be done. There's a much higher administrative burden. And so those costs have to go somewhere, and often banks and institutions tend to pass that on to the consumer. It also means that there's a lot more red tape. So if you want to apply for a new bank account or do a transaction overseas, there are a lot more forms to fill out. So it's quite an onerous administrative burden. For businesses, it can become quite a due diligence, complicated scenario where there are a lot more forms to fill out, a lot of time lags that are involved. So it tends to add to the cost of things.
With all that being said, Sanisha, how does greylisting affect South Africa's image and economy on a world stage?
Well, unfortunately, negatively, because we do get a little bit of a mark next to our name on the global report card. It essentially tells international investors, beware, there are some issues in South Africa in terms of illicit and financial crime action and how we actually go about combating that. And so from a reputational damage perspective, it could mean for businesses or trade partners that want to do business in South Africa that they think twice. And also because of those additional compliance issues, the administrative burden, the additional due diligence process that other countries and businesses have to make in South Africa, they may think twice about doing business with SA. And so we can lose out a bit in terms of our economic activity, prospects to trade with other countries. And ultimately, at the crux of that hurts our economic activity here.
And is there any direct read-through from greylisting for our sovereign rating?
So typically, no. There is a little bit of a link between the two, but ultimately, when you talk about sovereign ratings, it's about the ability of a nation's government to be able to repay debt. So there we'd be looking at fiscal dynamics, debt dynamics, socioeconomic progress, economic activity. And when we look at the grey listing, it's about the ability of a country to combat financial crimes, to ensure that we curb illicit financial transactions. And so the two are slightly different. Now, the loop in between is that if we are not combating illicit financial crime in the most adequate way, it does tend to raise borrowing costs for South Africans. Higher borrowing costs means that you don't get as much investment or spending into the economy, and so you have lower economic activity that comes out of that. And of course, that is a net negative for a sovereign rating agency that would be looking at a country's ability to repay its government debt.
And how does South Africa's grey listing compare to other countries that have been grey listed, like our neighbors and countries in a similar scenario to us?
Sure. So let's maybe start with our African peer group, as you state. If we look at Botswana, they were basically on the grey list for 3 years, but they did manage to get off because they had political will, and they managed to pivot quite easily on the policy changes that were required. A country like Mauritius was only there for a year, and they basically had to address some of the offshore finance components. Let's maybe think about Nigeria, not exactly the country that you would want to be compared with when it comes to illicit financial transactions, but they were actually placed on the grey list at the same time that South Africa was. And we face a similar problem in that we don't have enough financial resources and personnel resources to combat and curb illicit transactions in South Africa. But I also think it's quite interesting to note that, this year, South Africa was the only G20 country to actually be on the grey list. I mean, previously we had a Turkey and an Argentina that's also part of the G20 that made it onto the grey list previously. But it also talks to how we are also punching with some of the economic heavyweights in the global economy.
Are there any positives to being grey listed?
In a sense, yes, because I think this was a bit of an act of tough love. We were forced to look at the issues where we were not ticking the boxes and adequately assuming security levels to ensure that this financial crime does not take place in South Africa. So it was an opportunity for us to do the things that we were not really getting round to doing previously. So we have beefed up institutions like the National Prosecuting Authority. We've actually put through much more stringent laws in place. We've ensured that we can try and get the information from places like banks and businesses that are necessary to put criminals behind bars. So ultimately, this does contribute to make South Africa a better country, to ensure that we have the regulations in place to ensure that we're not vulnerable to financial crime. That makes us a far more attractive destination, especially in a world environment when we are now looking for new trade partners outside of the US. It's imperative that we have a good reputation on the global stage.
It sounds like a necessary evil for the long term. Sanisha, that's all the questions I have time for today. Thank you for helping us simplify the complexities of grey listing and its impact on access to global markets, investment, and opportunities for every South African. That's a wrap on today's episode, diving into South Africa's journey with grey listing. It's been a tough road being on the FATF grey list since 2023, with higher costs and global scrutiny hitting our economy. Sanisha, I look forward to chatting to you again soon.
Thank you, Levashni.
To our viewers, thank you for watching.